Hey, hopefully we'll have better luck than last week in terms of the recording. Last week I think it was a half decent shiur, but the sound didn't come out. But this time I think I plugged it into the right place, so hopefully it should go well. So, good evening, and here we are. We're about to discuss Parshas Vayechi, the final parsha or sidra really, in Sefer Bereshis. And the conclusion of as we talked about last week, one of the greatest stories ever told, the story of Yosef and his brothers, etc. And there's always much more to talk about, and Avram wants me to finish by 8:30, so it doesn't give us a whole lot of time. So we'll be able to scratch this. I don't know if we'll do that, but we'll scratch the surface of a few items. And last week we talked more about Yosef's tzidkus on one level of him seeing himself purely as somebody who Hashem sent to put there, and he didn't blame his brothers, etc. We talked about that last time. But there are several interesting questions in the story, and I'd like to at least start to deal with two of them. And one of them is, did Yaakov ever really know what happened? Right? Question. Did he know or did he not know? And there are various sources that we'll look at. Some indicate this way, some indicate that way, and maybe we'll come somewhere in the middle. And what can we learn out of that? And through that also I want to discuss, we talked about it last week, but I said we'll discuss it this week. What was Yosef trying to accomplish with all the stuff, we'll just call it, that he put his brothers through on the first time and the second time they came down to Mitzrayim with all the accusations and throwing Shimon in prison and hiding the cup and putting them through all sorts of angst and anxiety? What was he trying to do? Why did he do that? So we'll see if we can talk about some of those things. Okay. So one of the main reasons that this comes out as a question, because the Torah never clearly says one way or the other whether he told them or not. That certainly does. There's no scene in which we see that Yaakov and Yosef sit down and have a whole sit down and talk about it. We don't see that. What we do see, source 3 here in the sheets, towards the end of the parsha, after the whole funeral takes place. And by the way, I'll just mention it very briefly. That funeral was probably the largest funeral in history. Yaakov's funeral. It was. It says that they went up, Yosef and all of the ministers of Mitzrayim, and a huge delegation from Mitzrayim came up and they went, and it took months till they went, and they came, and they spent 30 days here and 7 days there, and huge procession. Why Yaakov wanted or said, I'll send you separately. I wrote an article which was in the Jewish press this week about, I think, why Yaakov made such a big deal about Eretz Yisrael and its connection to Eretz Yisrael, which I think is important.
It was a destination funeral.
What?
It was a destination funeral.
Yeah, it was. It sure was. That's right, a destination funeral.
They meet 31 kings.
Yeah, and they came and they put their crowns. The whole world came and stopped basically for this funeral. It was just an amazing thing. Anyway, after that they come back to Mitzrayim, and then scene 5, Act 3 begins. In part 3. Vayiru ache Yosef ki meis avihem. So the brothers of Yosef saw that their father died, vayomru, and they said, Lu. None of them were named Lu, but they said, Lu, yistamenu Yosef. Maybe Yosef will now, maybe he hates us, or I'm not sure exactly how to translate yistamenu, but he has, bad feelings about us, so let's leave it at that. V'hashev yashiv lanu et kol hara'ah. He'll give us back for all the of the bad. Go down asher gamalanu oto, so which we did to him. Next pasuk, vayitzavu Yosef lemor. So they commanded to Yosef, meaning what? They didn't do this themselves. They sent a messenger, right? They sent a messenger to say that avicha tziva lefnei Moshe lemor. Your father commanded. We have information that your father commanded like this. Back to the beginning. Kosamru li Yosef, next line. So shall you say to Yosef, Ana sana pesha achecha v'chatasam. Please forgive the sin of your brothers and their misdeeds. Ki ra'ag melucha, because they did bad to you. V'ata sana lefesha abdei Elohei avicha. Right? It's crazy the way this came out. And now please atone for the sins of the servants of the God of your father. Vayesk Yosef v'dabru melav. And then Yosef cried when he got this message. And then the brothers come. Vayelchu gam echav vayiplu ponav. Now the brothers also come and they prostrate themselves in front of him and they said, Hinenu lecha, where we pick this up? La vadim, at the end of the line, we're going to be for slaves to you. Then Yosef goes back there. Yosef says, Al tiro, don't be worried. Ki asachas elokim ani, am I in the place of God? Atem chashavtem alay l'ra'ah. You, Taka, thought bad for me, but elokim chashava l'tova. God turned it into a good thing. L'man asoka yom hazeh l'achios amarav. It came about that I was here in the position that I was able to have all these people live. And don't worry, I will take care of you. Vayinachem osam vayidaber al libam. He comforted them and spoke on their hearts. Okay.
But they still had this.
After all those years.
How many years is it, first of all?
12,
Like 17
14
years?
It's at least 17. It says Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim 17 years. At the beginning of the Parsha. 17
And all
years.
these years
Right?
they had this angst that
How
when
long
Dad
from the sale
dies,
till-
he's going to give it to us.
It's
Then
12
we'll
years.
really
Yep.
find out.
Right.
To what?
That's
Seven?
horrible.
From the
That's
sale.
terrible
Right.
psychological
When it came to
burden.
Mitzrayim,
No
it
wonder
was
he
Seems like a huge burden,
No
right?
wonder he
How many
cried.
years
To
from
think
the
that
sale?
somebody-
Not only that, all these years he thought that, apparently, that they understood that he didn't have any, bad intentions towards them, and that he'd been generous to them, and he's been good to them. And he now sees that they all think that they only did that because, basically, taking a chapter out of Esav said, when my father dies, then I'm gonna, get Yaakov. They thought something like this, right?
He must have felt
So he must have felt terrible, right? So, what's going on over here?
So did Yaakov really tell them that, or did they just
Well-
say that because they were?
That's the question. Did he or did he not? Right? So there's an interesting Gemara. Look at source 1. In the Gemara in Yevamah Samachay. Amar Rabbi Eloi Mishum Rabbi Elazar bar Reb Shimon, Muter lo la'adam l'shanos b'davra hashalom. When it comes to keeping the peace, you're allowed to be mishana, which basically means not an outright lie, but shading the truth a little bit, changing it a bit. White lie, we might call
what
it,
they said.
right? Changing it. How do we know that? Because the brothers said, Avichat Siva, that your father commanded. Surprise! For the second week in a row, we had pretty serious technical problems. So, the clip ended where it just ended. What I would like to do now is to briefly go over what we talked about for the rest of the shiur last night. And hopefully we'll get it all together for next week so that we'll go properly. So I was talking about the Gemara in Yevamos, in which the Gemara says that person is allowed to change, and we see that because we see that the brothers say that your father commanded, and in fact, apparently that never happened. Now, did it not happen because Yaakov never decided to do that, even though he knew about Yosef being sold by the brothers, or perhaps it never happened, didn't happen because Yaakov never knew? Gemara isn't clear about that. But there are several sources that weigh in on this. One of them is the Midrash in Parshas Vayechi. I will send the source sheet along with this video, in which the Midrash says, basically like this. He asks a question. We know that Yosef sent Yaakov and his brothers and families to live in Goshen. Yosef did not live in Goshen. He lived in the capital city. It wasn't Cairo in those days. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe Pison and Ramses. I don't know. What it was not Goshen. And in fact, if you look at the text in the beginning of the story, apparently Yosef did not see Yaakov very often. We see two incidents in which they talked in Mitzrayim, but other than that, not. And the Midrash asks, "V'harei kol shvachosha Yosef shahayam maflig al kavod aviv v'lo nichnas etzlo kol shah." How is it possible that Yosef didn't come into his father, or why didn't he come into his father? After all, all we heard about before was how much he missed him. We saw the incredibly emotional reunion that they had in Parshas Vayechi, where Yosef crying about him. You would assume that Yosef would want to spend as much time with his father as possible, but he didn't. Apparently he just came in very rarely, and the Medrash goes on. It seems that it says that Yosef was told that his father was sick. He didn't independently know. He didn't get the email blast or whatever. He didn't get a phone call. But he didn't know because he didn't live nearby. He didn't know his father, and then he had to go out and see him. So the Medrash says, "Lahodiachat tzidko." This was to tell you Yosef's great righteousness. Shelo ratza lehisyached im aviv. He did not want to be alone with his father. Why? Why did he not want to be alone? Because shelo yomerlo, he did not want to be in a situation in which his father would say, "Okay, it's just the two of us now. What really happened? What went on? What went down there when you visited your brothers?" He did not want that to occur. Because if they had done so, could be Mekalalam. If the father would have, said very negative, it says cursed, he would have been terribly hurt by that. So this means that for 17 years, Yosef kept his distance from his father. Whenever he came to visit him, he did not come along. Other people came along with it, whether it was his sons or others. So that Yaakov would not begin to talk to him about this matter. So, according to this midrash, Yosef never told him. Certainly his brothers probably never told him, so apparently Yaakov never knew exactly what happened. And in fact, that's what the Ramban says. Yireli, al derech hapshat, it seems to me, looking at the simple way of looking at it, shlo hugad liYaakov kol yamav, ki achiv machrus Yosef. Yaakov was never told the rest of his life that the brothers had sold Yosef. Avachashav, he thought what happened, in looking in retrospect, once he realized Yosef was still alive, he said probably what happened was hayatoeh basadeh, he got lost somehow on the way there. V'amotzimoso, and the people who found him, they took him and they kidnapped him and they sold him as a slave. Ki echav lo ratzu lahagid lo chatasam, the brothers didn't want to tell him what happened. Af ki yoru lenafsham, and they were afraid, that he would curse them, right? And in fact, as he said negative things about Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and therefore they didn't want to tell him. Viluyad, and Yosef b'musaro hatov, Yosef with his great personal tzidkus musar, his great ethical behavior, he didn't want to tell him. And in fact, he says that if the Yaakov did want to forgive them for some reason, he should have told Yosef with them present, that they should make peace. They shouldn't be in a sakana. And they wouldn't have to, lo yitztarchu levados b'libam dvarim, they wouldn't have had to make this up out of themselves, in their own mind. So we see this, and the Psikta also similarly says that it would seem, according to all these sources, Yaakov did not know. However, there are other sources, particularly if you look at the brachos that Yaakov gave Shimon and Levi and Yehuda. Look at Rashi there, when he said to Shimon and Levi, "Biritzonam akru shor," the ikru, when they had wanted to destroy the shor, the ox. He later refers to Yosef as Bechor Shor Hodolo, that he refers to him as the ox. Rashi says, quoting the Midrash, Ratzu la'akaras Yosef, they wanted to kill Yosef, they wanted to get rid of him, as it says Shor. And in fact, when it says, but to Yehuda, he says, Miteref bani Elisa, so what does that mean? right? I was concerned why you allowed Yosef to be eaten by a wild animal. That was like Yehuda. That maybe you're the one who caused his problems. So Yehuda shenim shala aryeh, and in fact, I still say that you said, when you said Bani Alisa, you came out not so bad from that situation because you said Mabetza. In other words, Yaakov is saying, I know that you guys knew. He knew what happened. What's pshat? How could this be? And Ramban certainly knows about this. So it's not easy to find a resolution. I saw one source that says maybe the resolution is that, in fact, Yaakov didn't know most rest of his life. But the brachas that he said were basically on his deathbed, just hours before he died. And maybe at that point he got a nevuah about it, but he didn't know about it before. Maybe that's the pshat. But others say differently. And in order to see what that was about, maybe we'll go back to the other question we talked about, which was, why did Yosef go through all those tormenting of his brothers? What was his purpose? And in fact, we can discuss another question. Why did Yosef tell him all those years? Why didn't he send a postcard from Egypt saying, Abba, I'm alive? Maybe we understand he couldn't do it when he was a slave. Maybe he couldn't do it from Potiphar's house. Certainly probably couldn't do it from the dungeon. But there were at least 9 years from the time that he became the Mishnah Lamelech, the viceroy, until the Yaakov found out. Why during those 9 years? Yosef certainly had the power of somehow notifying his father. Why didn't he do so? There are many who ask this question, and it's a difficult question. Some say, similar to Yitzchak Avinu, who also knew what was going on and didn't tell Yaakov. Well, if Hashem didn't tell him, then I shouldn't tell him. That's one I think Rashi brings that on about Yitzchak. Another reason brought down is because Yosef wanted to see the fulfillment of the dreams, that all the brothers would come and bow down to him, and he wanted to, make that happen, and that was in fact why he put them through all that stuff, so that they would come to the realization of the dreams. I find that hard to accept, frankly, because, it's one thing, his dreams, even if they were nevuah, they were high level, but, to put the whole family, and especially his father, through all that torment just so he could see his dreams fulfilled, that just doesn't seem right to me. Why didn't he do that? Another broad reason that's brought down is, and I've seen this more in Chabad type of sources, where Yosef was sent. After all, that's another question we talked about a little bit last week, which is, why did his father send Yosef into this very, very dangerous situation in which he knew that the brothers hated him? Why did he send him? Lech na re'eh et shlo b'chicha et shlo matzon, go see how your brothers and the sheep are doing. What's that all about? And vayishlachehu, and he sent him. So they said, basically, that Yosef was a shaliach. He was a agent, a shaliach, and then basically the Gemara says in many places is chazak a shliach shlichusai. A shliach is supposed to do the shlichus. He's supposed to accomplish it, and he sent him on a shlichus to accomplish. What was he supposed to accomplish? Not just to find out how they were doing, but you see the shlichus where when Yosef comes to Shechem and they ain't there, then the mysterious person who he met, Yosef asks him, the first man in history to ask for directions. He asked them, where do they go? Where can I find them? And they said they went to Dosan. But he uses an interesting word to say that they left here and they went somewhere else. He says, Nas'u mizeh. They left from this. Because I heard them saying they're going to Dosan. What is this nasu mizeh? In Hebrew you would say nasu mipo, or just nasu. What's nasu mizeh? So
it said that Zeh is an easy gematria. 7 plus 5 is 12. They left Zeh. They left this idea of them being 12. They considered Yosef already not to be one of them. Nas'umi Zeh. And Yosef's shlichus, his mission, was to try to get them back and try to once again restore the idea of Zeh. And that's something that you find throughout the story, what Yosef is trying to accomplish. In fact, at the end of Parshas Vayechi, one of the last psukim, it says that Yosef told them that you'll be here until somebody comes along and says, Bakod yivkod eluchim eschem, va'alisem et atzmosai mizeh itchem. That someday Hashem will redeem you, and you will bring my bones out mizeh itchem, together with Zeh, with you. That once again you will be restored to that sense of unity of 12. Took a long time to accomplish that. It was accomplished briefly at Sinai when they were Ke'ish Echad B'Lev Echad, and we well know throughout Jewish history, unfortunately very much till our time, Jews are not particularly good at getting along with each other. But that was the shlichus to try to accomplish that. Until Yosef felt that he had accomplished it, he couldn't go back to Yaakov, because the shliach can't come back until he accomplishes that shlichut. So that shlichut was try to get them together. And maybe taking that in a little bit of a different direction, Rav Hirsch says that what Yosef was trying to accomplish with all of the back and forth, etc., was one thing. He had a conundrum. He could have sent that postcard. He could have let Yaakov know, I'm in Egypt, and you know how I got here. Basically, the brothers sold me, and now I'm here. And if he had done that, yes, Yaakov would have been able to stop grieving over Yosef, and that sadness might have lifted from him, but a much greater sadness would have come upon him, which is that he would have, in a sense, lost the other sons who had done such a grievous thing. And he would never be able to look at them in a positive way. So what Yosef was trying to do with all of his machinations was to bring about a situation in which the brothers could prove that they had done teshuvah. And the brothers actually before that even started to do teshuvah. When Yosef accuses them of being spies, the Midrash tells us that's because they went in all different sides of Egypt to look in all kinds of places. They asked a lot of questions. They even went to some of the seedy kind of places, perhaps because he was so good looking. They would thought that he had been sold as a sex slave. Who knows what was going on? But they were sure that, the dreams that he had would never come true. He would never be in a position where they would have to bow down to him. But they figured that by now he'd learned his lesson, and they wanted to find him and bring him home. And that's a topic for another time, how the brothers never recognized Yosef, even though he was standing right in front of them. They could never see that this was in fact Yosef. Okay, be that as it may, but what Yosef was trying to accomplish was to see to it that they were put in a situation, particularly at the end, where Binyamin is with them finally, and he's the one who they find the cup, and his agent says to them, they say, we're all going to become slaves, we're all this Oivei, what's going on? And he says, you got nothing to worry about. The one who took the cup, Binyamin, he's going to come and be a servant to Yosef in Egypt, and the rest of you go home. Everything will be fine. Alola shalom el avichem. No, I don't want anything from you. You can be fine. And the question was, when they were in that situation where they could just leave that one brother behind, the son of Rachel, would they do that and go back, or would they fight with everything they had to make sure that brother never left them? And that's what they did. They went back to Egypt, and Yehuda gave his long soliloquy, and they made it clear that they were not going to make their peace with this ever, and they would do whatever it takes to get Binyamin out. Once they did that, Yosef was finally able to reveal himself to them. He said those words, Ani Yosef, Haod Avichai. I am Yosef. Is my father still alive? You're a bunch of hypocrites. You're telling me all these things that it would be terrible if to the father, if the son goes away, how did my father take my absence? How did you do this to him for all these years? That was a hard thing for them to hear, but it was something in which they were able to do tshuva, but they were able to, in a certain sense, hold their heads high because they had proven that they had put that in the past, and now given a similar situation, and they were able to do the right thing. The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva talks about that when do we know that a person really did tshuva? If the person finds himself in the same situation, with the same, as he puts it, with the same woman, with the same ability to do the negative thing, etc., and he doesn't do it, not because he can't, but just because he's done tshuva, and now he knows it's the wrong thing to do. That's when a person really shows tshuva. And they showed that they were in a situation where they could have deserted a brother, and they did not. And therefore, when Yaakov, according to this way of looking at it, maybe he did hear about what had happened in Egypt, but he also knew at the same time that his brothers had in fact done tshuva, and the brothers were not where they used to be, and therefore Yaakov was able to accept them all back together again. So that's certainly another way of looking at the story. I'll just finish with this summary of what we talked about, and we went to some other things. I won't go to all, but I think with two things. First of all, when it says that Yaakov was informed of that Yosef was still alive, it says that Vayidabru Elav Eskol Divrei Yosef Asher Diber Alehem, that they said to Yaakov everything that Yosef had told them, which could mean everything that happened. All Divrei Yosef means not just what he said to them, but the whole story. And we don't know. Again, different sides. Did Yaakov know? Did Yaakov not know? Interesting question. Fascinating question. But they said this to him, and it says, Lo ha'amin lahem. He didn't believe them. But what happened? Vayaris ha'agalos asher yashalach Yosef laseso. So he saw the wagons that Yosef had said to bring him back to Egypt, and then Vatechi ruach Yaakov avim. Yaakov's spirit once came alive when he saw the agalos. So, famously in the yeshiva world, they say, what's that about? I mean, Rashi brings down, because basically they were learning the sugya of Egla Arufa. What's Egla Arufa? We'll talk about in a minute. But they were learning that the laws of Egla Arufa, and that's the last thing Yosef and Yaakov had learned together. And now, all these 22 years later, when Yaakov saw that Yosef was sending him like a hint, the Agolos and the Egla, he still remembers what we were learning, he's still holding in what we're learning. And, I heard this many times in yeshiva, that, Talmidei Chachamim always talk to each other in learning, and they remember what they talked about the last time they learned together, and this is the way it ought to be. Look at, how wonderful it is that they're holding and learning. Okay, that's very nice. But even assuming that is true, I think it's still worthy of thinking about why, of all things, were they learning about the sugya of Egla Arufa, and does that tell us anything about in this story that's a little bit beyond the surface? So what's the din of Egla Arufa? The din of Egla Arufa is that if a corpse is found out in the wild, in between cities, and it looks like he died because he didn't have what he needed, whether it was food, whether it was protection. He had not gotten what he needed to continue on his travels in his previous place. So the elders of the various cities around measure from the corpse to the city to find which one was the closest city. The elders of that city have to come out and say, our hand, Yadeinu lo shafchu et hadam hazeh v'einenu lo ra'u. It's not our hands that spilled this blood. We didn't see this. We didn't send him away like that. Or if they can say that, maybe they should. The idea, of course, is that they should investigate. And in fact, if he was not treated correctly, they need to go and see what they can do to correct that and to do tshuva for it. But basically, they want to say that we don't know what happened, and they ask that Hashem should forgive because this thing had happened. So the story of Egla Arufa, in a certain sense, is then that we're trying to assess blame, and we're not sure who is to blame for this corpse that had found. And it occurred to me that that might be perhaps what's going on in this story as well, in that, it's not so clear exactly who's to blame. Of course, the brothers get the lion's share of the blame for what happened with Yosef. However, what about Yosef? He did say bad tidings about them. He did parade himself a little bit in front of them. He did, in a certain sense, make them jealous. Does he share any of the blame for what happened? And speaking of that, maybe Yaakov shares some of the blame for what happened. Yaakov did show favoritism to him. He did give him the Ksonis Pasim, the multicolored coat. He did seem to treat him in a way that was, different than the others. He gave the brothers enough reason that they felt threatened, that Yosef is going to be the one taking over the legacy and they're going to be relegated like Ishmael was discarded from, and Yosef was discarded from the heirs to the legacy of Abraham. Maybe they would also be discarded and it would continue through Yosef. And maybe, who is at fault for that? Egla Arufa. They had to measure it out. Everybody had something to answer for a little bit in this story, because it's not so clear. I often think about when I went to law school, one of the most important lessons I learned from Professor Wing of Shalom was that he once said that if you guys don't start to recognize that there are two sides to every case, and maybe more, half of you won't have jobs. In other words, it's very rare that one side is 100% right and the other side is 100% wrong, that one side has all the good arguments and the other side does not. Usually there's arguments on both sides. One side often has more arguments, and as a lawyer, your job is to try to find the best argument for your client, even if you're not on the great side. But I don't want to get into that now. But here, there was some blame to go around. And that's perhaps something to do with the idea of Egla Arufa. So did Yaakov know? Did he not know? It's not clear. It seems most of the Mefarshim, however, and the Ramban and Psikta and the Midrashim say that Yaakov did not know. And I thought one other final lesson that we could take from this is that if in fact Yaakov didn't know, and that means that Yosef never told him, we have to think about, when we think about Yosef HaTzadik, that he was such a saintly person. You often think about his holding back from the temptation of Mrs. Potiphar, and how he was able to conduct himself and bring Kiddush Hashem when he was called up to Paro. But perhaps this is no less an unbelievable aspect of Yosef's tzidkus. Imagine if you had been in his shoes, and you had suffered all those years as a slave and being ripped away from your family and then thrown in a dungeon, and you'd probably be steaming, not only in anger and in wishes for vengeance, and etc. You would be dying to tell Yaakov what happened. You'd be dying to tell your side of the story. Yosef, who we saw last week, he says, to the brothers, you didn't send me here, Hashem sent me here. He didn't look at it in a way that it was about his personal hurt, but he was an instrument of God. But here even goes to another whole level. For 17 years, for all those rest of the years, where Yosef probably would have been plotting to tell Yaakov what happened. He refrained from doing so, and he refrained from doing so basically to protect his brothers, the very ones who had hurt him so grievously. He didn't talk about it. And, that's a big lesson for us, for what information we feel sometimes we can't share, even though we would like to share it, even though it's something that's, very much would like to be able to tell somebody about something. But if others will get hurt by that, beyond the laws of Lashon Hara, etc., of course, it takes a big Baal Bandrega to be able to hold back for the greater good. And Yosef was able to pass that test. Of course, throughout the whole story, it's so important for us to be able to keep the big picture in mind and not get lost in day-to-day situations, but to understand that Hashem has bigger plans for Klal Yisrael and for us, and we need to try to sit back and see how we can fit into the larger things and not get caught up with our personal petty grievances. And through that, Mitzvah Hashem, to try to strive always for Jewish unity and to bring Mashiach b'meira v'yameinu.